my first and last hunting trip. I'm 24 years old and live on my own. My parents have never been around, staying stuck between rehab and jail, so I've had to fend for myself ever since I was young. I have two jobs at the moment, one at a restaurant and another washing cars. It's safe to say that things can get pretty stressful, but regardless, I always kept pushing forward. One night, however, I have to admit my patience was severely tested. While bussing tables at my restaurant job, some teenagers were getting a little too rowdy. They were sitting in a booth laughing and yelling, obviously disturbing the other customers. I had already been sent to warn them once, but I guess it did no good. I understood trying to have a good time, but they were downright annoying. I approached the table with a stern look and reminded them to keep it down. That's when one of the teens stood up and defended his antics. He told me they had just come from prom and were trying to hang out, and that I needed to step off before he got really mad. This close to him, I could smell the alcohol on his breath. I knew I needed to be cautious around a drunk kid, but we had rules to follow. I told him if he didn't keep it down, they would have to leave. Just then, a cocky smirk crawled across his face. Before I could react, he picked up his drink and threw it on me. Now soaked with cheap soda, my patience went out the window. I grabbed that little punk and was about to show him a thing or two about respecting his elders. Fortunately for that brat, my boss would grab and drag me to the back. The very wise and patient owner looked at me and sighed. He told me that he'd never seen me so angry before. I quickly reminded him that someone's beverage was thrown in my face, but he shook his head, telling me that wasn't it. For the past few weeks he had been watching and could tell I was going through some things. This man had run restaurants all of his life and knew a thing or two about stress. Maybe I was. I never got any days off and didn't have anyone to spend them with if I did. Working and giving every cent you have to bills would stress anyone out. My boss would implore me to take a week off from everything and enjoy some me time. I told him off time wouldn't pay the bills, but he wouldn't take no for an answer, telling me that I was being taken off the schedule for a week and that I needed to go home and get some rest. Now back at my place, I felt a bit lost. Working was sort of my life, and now I was forced to come home. The next thing I knew, someone was knocking at my door. I got up to greet them, hoping it wasn't my landlord. Instead, standing before me was my spoiled cousin Carl. Carl came from a well-off family and got everything he wanted. Nice truck, a beautiful home, and loads of firearms. He was an avid outdoorsman and killed more wildlife than the law should allow. And he was one of my only family members that had anything to do with me. So I put up with him and sometimes enjoyed his company. I was going to tell him how crappy my day was, but he was here for something else. Carl told me he rented a cabin in the woods for a hunting trip and wanted me to go. He knew I wasn't a hunter, but I guess he wanted someone to tag along. Usually I'd say no and tell him how busy I was, but this time I had absolutely nothing else to do. And maybe a vacation would be just what the doctor ordered. So I shrugged my shoulders and told Carl I would go. He was pretty happy, and I was just hoping to blow off some much-needed stress. So the very next day, Carl and I headed into the wilderness. While I planned to just lounge around the cabin, Carl brought every firearm he had. This so-called hunting trip could have been mistaken for a war party. Carl was so head-set on helping me bag my first deer, but I wasn't really interested. Upon arrival, we went inside and unpacked. The cabin was so nice. Way too rich for my blood. There were deer heads with beautiful antlers mounted on every wall, an old fireplace that gave a rustic and cozy feel, not to mention a literal bearskin rug stretched out across the wooden floor. In all honesty, I was glad I came. The decor alone was worth it. Always looking for a good time, Carl was quick to pull out the beers and place one in my hand. Now in vacation mode, I was happy to oblige. So we threw some logs in the fireplace and sat around talking about life. I vented to him about how hard I was always working, and he gloated about his many guns. It was actually a pretty nice conversation, all things considered. But then the alcohol started to kick in. Carl never could handle his liquor. As the tops popped, he seemed to get a little more irritable with each sip. What started as a friendly chat led to him harassing me. First it was how I had to work so much and didn't have a life. Then he prattled on about how I didn't have any friends but him. I tried not to pay him any mind, but his words hurt. I couldn't help the cards I was dealt, and he should have known that. He knew full well how difficult my parents had always been. Knowing I was about to punch him in the nose, I had to get away. I told Carl that maybe I'd try hunting since he loves it so much. I grabbed one of his many rifles and left him to his drunkenness. Again, I had never hunted in my life, but anything was better than being insulted. Outside, I noticed that it was getting pretty dark and a little cold. Though I probably shouldn't have, I persisted anyway. The forest was so deep and seemed to swallow me up. I could hear the sounds of twigs cracking and small animals scurrying around. While peaceful for some, I had to admit that I was nervous. Being this far out in the wilderness was definitely new for me. I didn't plan to kill anything, so I don't even know why I brought the rifle. Perhaps if I came upon a bear, I would have a way to scare it off. As I walked deeper, the silence seemed to get worse. It was like I was on a newly discovered planet all by my lonesome. After a few moments, I came upon something odd. Sticking out from the bushes, I could see what looked like a deer's antlers. Feeling excited, I decided to get a bit closer. As I did, however, I discovered something awful. Laying in the bushes was indeed a deer, albeit one that was ripped apart. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The graceful animal had been brutalized and blood was everywhere. I'll save the dirty details for those of you who are squeamish. It was so bad that I fell to the ground and began to vomit. What could have done this to that poor animal? It was just so violent. Before I could gather my bearings, footsteps rivaling that of thunder approached me. I don't know if it was another hunter or an angry grizzly, but I wasn't going to wait around. I turned back, hoping to leave, but it was too late. Standing before me was something that I couldn't comprehend. It was a massive ape-like creature that stood over 8 feet tall. It had dark brown matted hair with 2 glowing red eyes. The creature's hands were covered in blood and chunks of meat hung from its mouth. Putting 2 and 2 together, I figured out that deer was its prey, and the idiot that interrupted his meal was me. With fire in its eyes, it backhanded me so hard that both my feet left the ground. This resulted in my cousin's rifle flying in the opposite direction. Now laying on my back, all I could see were stars. In all my life, I had never been hit so hard. I would once again attempt to flee, but it was obvious I had a concussion. I also reached for my forehead and felt a large gash, one that was gushing blood and took away my vision. Regardless of all the pain I was in, I didn't want to die here. I attempted to crawl to safety, but those colossal footsteps weren't far behind. I had never believed in monsters, but this thing was real and it was mad. I crawled and crawled, certain that it was toying with me. At one point it let out a demonic grunt, one that almost sounded like laughter. I was sure this was it for me, murdered by a cryptid. What a way to go. But as luck would have it, fate had other plans. While trying to slink away, my hand touched something hard. I couldn't believe it. It was Carl's rifle. With the monster on my tail, I grabbed his gun and didn't hesitate. I shot at the creature, hitting his massive chest. Upon impact, the monster backed away from me, clutching its right side. I could see the blood and smoke pouring from its wound. He let out a pang howl before dropping to one knee. Since it was grounded, I knew now was the time to flee, and I would never return to those woods again. Follow for more.